Welcome, everybody,
Hi,
and
Paul.
welcome to the Growing with Purpose podcast. I'm so excited to be doing a live event like this for the first time, and we're here celebrating a 15-year anniversary of the Small Giants community. Hard to believe, and I've got my special guest with most of all of you know. It's just Bo Burlingham. So wave, Bo. Welcome. And so we thought we'd do today is just have a casual conversation, which Bo is great at, and talk about what's gone on during the last 15 years. And we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. You guys submitted some great questions, so we'll get to a bunch of those and even do maybe a couple live. So just wonderful to see some great old friends and new friends joining us. So thank you guys for being here. So Bo, let's just kind of get started. Like most, if not all of us, read the book at some point, was inspired by the book, and somehow got connected to the community over time. But you wrote the book and published it in early 2006, and it came after you wrote this article for Inc. magazine on Zingerman's, and were approached to talk about other companies. And what I remember is that you focused on these 5 or 6 things that you found to be the common threads among these companies that you termed small giants. Can you reflect a little bit on what those things were?
Sure. I really just wanted to, once I had identified, I mean, the book started with a question. It was a question that was asked to me by a publisher after I had written that book on Zingerman. Zingerman's had been a very successful delicatessen. After 10 years, it was world famous, really, and considered one of the great delicatessens. And they had lots of opportunities that you have if you're that successful. They were having lots of people who wanted to open Zingerman's in other cities and towns and college towns especially. And they could have franchised easily. And a lot of people told them they were crazy not to. They could have also raised private equity and probably set up their own Zingermans around the country, but they decided that wasn't something they wanted to do. So the founders, Ari Weinzweig and Paul Saginaw, really put their heads together and came up with a plan that they were not going to expand the delicatessen. They instead were going to establish a whole community of businesses that would all be all be food related, all be in the Ann Arbor area. So that and each would strive to be great and unique in its own right. And so that was really the theme of the article. And a publisher called me up and said, basically, are there other companies like this? Well, I had no idea. I had never heard of any company like Zingerman's before, but I thought it was a good question. So that's when I went around and began asking people if they knew of any companies that had had an opportunity to get a lot bigger and grow a lot faster, but had chosen not to because they had other goals that they considered more important. And I began to get suggestions. I began to find things as I looked for them. And I pretty soon discovered that they were in fact all over the country and in practically every business niche. There was some company that really qualified, that had really, been emerged as sort of the quintessential example of that business, and yet had chosen not to exploit that for all it was worth. And so once I had found these, there were so many out there that I was able to sort of choose among them. And I just chose those that I thought would allow me to explore what this was all about. And one of the things I went and interviewed all the companies, and I spent some time at each of them, and and the question that came up to me was, well, what do they have in common? You know, they they all had this sort of um, neat, sort of magical quality that I call mojo. Actually, one of the Gary Erickson of Cliff Bar was the one who uh, gave me the word mojo, and they all had it. I defined it as the business equivalent of charisma. You know, when you want to follow a leader, when a leader has charisma, you want to follow him or her. When a business has mojo, you want to be associated with that business. You want to work for it. You want to you want to sell to it. You want to buy from it. You know, you just want to be around that business, and that was one thing that all these companies had in common. Now, and the question I had was why? How had they managed to sort of create this sort of magical connection with their customers and their suppliers and their employees uh, and so I said, well, let me look at what they've got in common, and I came up with I guess it was 6 characteristics that I wound up feeling that they all had in common. Number one was they were all led by people who had a very clear idea of who they were, what they wanted, and why. Um, that was very important because when they made their decision not to get as big as possible, as fast as possible, they were frequently told, "You're crazy. You've got this great opportunity. Why aren't you doing it?" And if you don't know exactly what you're doing and why, you don't have an answer to that question. But all these companies that I looked at, they had leaders who really did have that clear sense of why they were in business in the first place. Second thing I noticed was that all of these companies had very close connections to the communities in which they were doing business. You know, if you look at Zingerman's at Ann Arbor, or you look at Anchor Brewing in San Francisco, I mean, these were companies you could have great beer companies all over the country, and there are, as we all know, many great beer companies. But Anchor Brewing was part of San Francisco. In fact, it was a historic part of San Francisco. So that was one thing, and it reflected being in that in that area. And then the third thing really had to do with the extraordinary relationship that all these companies had with their customers. They, you know, there was like this closeness. They would work on, as much as possible, the companies would work on establishing personal relationships with the customers, so that they actually went out of their way to be as closely connected to their customers individually as they could. And yet, oddly enough, for many of these companies, it wasn't that the customers came first, it was that the customers came second. First, or they would probably say the customers came first along with, but from where I was sitting at, they really, their first priority was really their employees, because you know, when a company gets to be above a certain size, it's no longer the owner who has that relationship with the customers. And if you want to project this kind of magical connection with your customers, you better have employees who feel the same way about what you're doing as the owner does. And so that was what they all they all strove to do and to create. And there were lots of examples of that in the book. There was something else that I discovered, actually, I unfortunately discovered it after I had first written the book. And that was when some of the companies that I'd written about had gotten into trouble. And I realized that I'd missed a chapter. And so I went to my publisher and I said, listen, we've got to do another edition of this book because I've got to add a chapter or two to it. And fortunately, I had a very good publisher who I loved, namely um, Adrian Sackheim at uh, and he said, yes, okay, we'll do another edition. So we wound up coming out with the 10th anniversary edition, which is the one that I encourage everybody to buy and read, as opposed to the first edition. The 10th anniversary edition has a chapter called Why Small Giants Fail. And it was really about, it's really based on the problems that some of the companies had gotten into. And there were very sort of specific examples of it. And I came up with some important things that these companies had to do in order to make sure that they stayed in business. I mean, you can be the most wonderful, loving, mindful company in the world, but if you're not in business, it doesn't really matter very much. And so that was the next one. And then the final one really had to do with well, it had to do, again, it went back to the leaders of the company and where they were taking the company. And those were really the characteristics that I looked at. And if you step back and look at it, it makes sense because what you're talking about with each of these things is relationships. And it was, business is really, I like to say that business is really nothing more than a group of people who have gotten together and are trying to create something, either a product or a service that other people want to buy. And if it's good enough, the other people will be willing to pay you more than it costs you to create it. That's what that's profit. Profit is essentially applause from the customers. And it is really all about putting making all those relationships with all the people. When you look at a business, look at all the people who it comes into contact with. It comes into contact with, obviously, its employers and its community and its customers, its suppliers. And if all of those relationships are really special and they've really worked on them to make them the best that they can make them, then that's the essence of Mojo. And actually, oddly enough, the last term I came up with in writing the book was the name, Small Giants. I didn't have a name when I started writing the book, and I went through and wrote the whole book, and I was always talking about these companies with Mojo. And then I gave the manuscript to my publisher. The publisher loved it and said, but we've got to have a title for this. And I said, what about companies with Mojo? And the publisher said, no, nobody will understand what you're talking about. And I had to concede that was probably the case. So I decided to actually ask some of the companies that were in the book to help me come up with a title. And one of the companies was Jay Goltz's company. You may have heard him if you listen to Lauren Feldman's wonderful 21 Hats podcasts and newsletter. You've probably run across Jay Goltz. Well, Jay has a genius for coming up with catchy titles. And he said, well, look, you're talking about companies they're really striving to be great. They want to be the best in the world at what they do, but they aren't necessarily big companies. So they're sort of giants, but they're sort of small giants. And I said, oh, okay. And I ran it by my publisher, and they loved it. And they said, yes, let's call it Small Giants. That's wonderful. So we wound up calling the book Small Giants, and I had to go back through the entire manuscript, and everywhere where I said companies with mojo, I had to put in Small Giants. So in the end, that's where Small Giants came from.
Yeah, that's a great story, and thanks to Jay for coming up with a wonderful title. And thank goodness you wrote that 10th anniversary edition, because in that, at the end, you mentioned the Small Giants community.
Right.
And so, uh,
Well,
I remember,
obviously
like,
it didn't exist when
that's
I
right.
first
That's
edition.
right. So, like many people on the call, I read the book. It was early 2007. And I had just finished writing my own book about culture and engagement. And I was so inspired by what you had written that I wrote you a blind email. And I said, you don't know me, but I loved your work. And I just wrote this book. Would you consider writing a foreword for my book? So I had the courage to ask, at least. And you said yes. And the first thing you said was, when do you need it? And I said, not right away. And a couple months later, I'll never forget, I was on a vacation with my dad and my brother, and it was lunchtime, and I get this text with your beautiful foreword to the book. And that started what's now been, a 20-year friendship, which I really value, Bo. And it took me a couple years bugging you to say that there were many other business leaders that felt this way about business and purpose and values and passion. And as a kind of a self-described introvert and not a great networker, those are the people I wanted to hang out with. If I could find people like this that thought this way about business and life, that's who I wanted to meet, and suggested we start a community to do that. And I think we were in Dallas one night and having dinner, and you finally said, Paul, stop bugging me. I'm a writer. I'm not a business person, but if you want to do this, I'll support you any way I can. And so that's how the community was born back in 2009, 2010, and off we went. And so it's wonderful to celebrate 15 years. We know we saw a lot of you at our annual summit a couple of years ago. So it's just been a wonderful ride. And as you know, the community has brought together people in a way that's really unique and really special. And I think what you just said is so true about business and life, but it's all about relationships. And even though we put together all these people and create content and have speakers and all that, at the end of the summit, we were looking at the surveys the other day that came back. What was most special was just the people and the relationships. It's almost like we could get everybody together, put in a room, and we don't have to do anything and just let them hang out, because we like to hang out with like-hearted people, we say, and that's what the community is all about. As you know, the community has it kind of morphed over the years, like any business, where we focused early on primarily on founders and CEOs and building kind of a CEO peer group. And then HEMSA came on board to lead the community now almost 9 years ago, and has just done an incredible job, where we realized that for some of these practices to survive in companies long term, it wasn't necessarily going to be the founder and CEO. It was going to be what we call the next generation of leaders. And so that's where we developed our leadership academy. And I love that focus. I think it's seems to be unique, although we're certainly seeing other purpose-driven communities, which is wonderful to see that grow. But this focus on the next generation is something I think that's been really important to us, and we've leaned into in a great way, because we see so much passion and idea sharing along the way. As you reflect back now, Bo, what do you think has changed? I mean, do you think that this methodology of acting like a small giant type of company is becoming more mainstream or more accepted?
Well, I want to say first that what really validated for me my decision to put all of this on you, Paul, that is somebody who had already built a business and knew what building a business was about, was that when we started the Small Giants community, the question was, how are we going to make it survive? We weren't going to charge membership, were we? And we decided no. And when you have an entity like that, at some point you've got to have some mechanism for getting revenue into the company, into the organization, that allows you to perform these various functions. And Paul, you understood that. And I think and of course Hemza really sort of inspired it all. And I think it was out of that you realized that there was actually a market for the next generation. That the CEOs, the main problem with CEOs is that they're pressed for time. They have no time to do anything. So if we tried to build it around participation by CEOs, we were going to have to struggle to get their time, their attention, and but one thing all those CEOs had in common was that they wanted the people who they regarded as the next generation to be. They wanted those people to have the opportunity to understand what it was that they were trying to do. And by putting together the Small Giants Leadership Academy, that gave them an outlet, and they were happy to pay for it. I remember I talked to Bill Rourke down in Huntsville, Alabama, of Torch Technologies. By the way, he's got a book that's coming out just now, and about the purposeful owner, and he's a very good example. But in any event, I knew that he was sending people to the Leadership Academy, and I asked him why. Why do you keep sending them? He said, well, I go with the feedback I get from the people I've sent before. They all say it's a tremendous experience, and that they've learned a lot from it. And so that gives me a reason to send somebody the following year. And he's been doing that pretty regularly. I would, by the way, for all of you, I assume most of you out there are in fact small giants yourselves. You're certainly interested in it, or you wouldn't be here. I would really encourage you to look for Bill's new book. He's got an amazing story himself of where he came from and how he built a company. I will say this about Bill. Bill at one point told me that his goal was to create millionaires. And the fact is that I've lost track of the number of millionaires. I think he's lost track too, because that's how he's built his company. It's an employee-owned company, and he does have all of these employees that have become quite wealthy, or reasonably wealthy, by working at the company. And he just created a magic there. I could have included him in the book. I could have included Paul. Paul's company was a call center, a very unusual one, that I visited, and it's unlike any call center I'd ever seen. There were balloons all over the place, and people were having fun. If I'd known Beryl, I would have included Beryl in the book. But fortunately, I was able to meet all of them, as well as, other companies, including the companies of people who are here on this podcast. Tom Walters' company, Eric Rieger's company. These are all great companies, and for me, they're very inspirational.
Well, that's the whole idea, is that we're all aspiring small giants, at least, if not having gotten there, whatever that criteria is. I do remember in the early days, because I never got into this to make money, but it was everything was free, and you were saying, you got to start charging for some of this. And HEMS has been on me for years to make sure we're generating some revenue to at least try to be sustainable. So at least we've achieved that over the years, which has been really nice. Bo, when you think about some of the things that have happened over these last years, these kind of macro trends, whether it's things that have gone on in the economy or COVID or the hybrid work environment, do you think that small giants type companies have endured through these challenges, or maybe approached things differently than other companies have done?
Well, based on what I've seen, the answer is yes. I mean, if you just look at our summit that we just concluded, I guess it was about a month ago or so, there were lots of companies there that had come through and that were very enthusiastic about, you know, being small giants themselves, and they're eager to learn what other companies are doing and how they can improve. And I have to say that yes, the small giants companies, in some ways, the small giants companies, I think, have a certain advantage because of these relationships that they've built up. They're very flexible. And in a crisis, the most important thing you can have is flexibility. That is, to be able to respond as changes happen, so that you can respond with your customers, with your suppliers, but it's your employees who are going to pull off the changes. And I think that it's actually been a very good period for small giants, and the ones I know have come through very successfully. I will say that some of the companies in the book, particularly Gary Erickson's company, Cliff Bar, sort of the story that I tell about in the book was how he had been offered something like $100 million for his company, and he decided to walk away from it because he felt he could still. Well, he ultimately, he and his wife Kit Erickson wound up selling their company for, I don't know, some several $billions. So their decision to not accept the $100 million turned out to be a good financial decision, as well as a good decision for their own enjoyment of what they were doing.
Yeah, I think some of these challenging times like COVID actually created some really interesting and positive opportunities for companies, particularly small giants. Topics like mental health or equality and diversity, things that we didn't really talk about a lot, are now being talked about at least more, and they're being more acceptable. I think those are good things. I think probably the biggest challenge I've seen over the last couple of years is people adjusting to the new way of working, meaning if we're now remote permanently, or I think the most popular is some sort of hybrid environment. And people that are very culture focused are still trying to figure out what is that combination of relationships and practices. How do we institutionalize a culture when we're not seeing each other all the time? But we're seeing a lot of creativity there at the same time as people are coming up with ideas and sharing them. That's, again, what the community is all about. So we're able to get through those things together. I'd love to open it up to any of you, if you want to use the raised hand feature so we can find you, let you ask a live question to Bo or me, and we can continue the discussion for the last 12 or 13 minutes here. Um, what's the financial impact, do you think, Bo, of being a small giant, right? When people think about this, the culture, which is sometimes not something you can measure, how do we know that it's got an ROI?
Well, you know that, Paul, personally, because you sold your company, Barrel, for what, $200 million, something like that.
No, don't. You're way over, Bo. You're way over.
Uh,
But
okay,
it was a high multiple. We'll say that for
yeah, it
sure.
was a high
Yeah.
multiple. Okay, um, but if you look at Gary Erickson, obviously it's hasn't hurt him to be a small giant. In fact, it has kept it. And Danny Meyer's another one in the book. And when I wrote the book, Shake Shack was just a little stand in Madison Park next to where some of his restaurants were. And now it's a big national public company. In fact, he wound up being sure to separate uh, um, Shake Shack from the rest of the Union Square Hospitality Group because he wanted the Union Square Hospitality Group to continue as small giants, but Shake Shack had this tremendous uh, expansion potential to get very, very, very big, and couldn't really uh, remain what it was. Couldn't really remain a small giant. Um, so, you know, I think if you just go down the list of companies, uh, well, I should say this is that, you know, life goes on and life changes. And with some of the companies in the book, um, people get older. And, I wrote another book called Finish Big, which some of you might want to read because it's about a different subject, namely, by the way, Jay Goltz also helped me title that company. So if you have if you have a book you want to write, I recommend talking to Jay. Um, but in any event, in Finish Big, um, you know, I, 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 I talked about how every business, every entrepreneur exits their business. They may exit them feet first. They may build the company until they die, which there's nothing wrong with, but they're going to exit one way or the other. And that is something that people have to prepare for. Uh, even if you do plan to exit feet first and be carried out in a gurney, um, you still have to think about um, what's going to happen and how that's going to affect all the other people that you have been working with, uh, because otherwise, what you're going to wind up doing is leaving a big mess in the laps of the people who you care most about in the world, namely your family and your close associates and your employees and all the people in the company. So it's something
Yeah,
that
yeah.
has to be thought about and worked at. And I'm happy to say that Zingerman's in particular has done a really good job of thinking that through.
That's right. Great book that we encourage people to read. Speaking of Jay and all that, he may have another name for your next book, but Jay, you got a comment. Join us.
Yeah, hi. I was gonna say, when you wrote the book, I was 50. Now I'm 68. And I can tell you the whole concept of return on investment has changed in my head. It's certainly about money, but there's a lot, which is the crux of the book. It's not just about money. I can't tell you how the satisfaction and joy I get from knowing that I have provided meaningful livelihoods and missions for my employees. Not every one of them. Some of them are just coming to do the job and go home. But I feel great that I've provided a place for people to come to work and feel good that they've done something meaningful. And the world has come to our way in the last 5-10 years. The new generation, I think, want to work in a place like that more than 20 years ago. I think they might have scratched their head. They wouldn't even know what you were talking about. So there's tremendous return on investment. And I've also learned that I have to take the title of the book from the guy that started Enough, the book Enough.
Yeah.
What's the name of the cheap place you buy stocks? Cut out the middleman. God, see, I'm 68. I forgot. Anyway, the point is there is such a thing as enough money. And I wouldn't have said that 20 years ago. And
Yeah.
if you can make enough money and feel great about what you do every day, what a tremendous return on investment that is.
Yeah, totally agree. I want to go to one of the questions.
Vanguard, that's the name. Vanguard. The guy
Yeah.
that started Vanguard.
Yeah. All right. See, you're only 68.
See,
Uh,
it took me a minute there.
One of the questions that came up that was submitted in advance, I want to speak to because it says, uh, can you give examples of tough choices you've seen businesses make where the small giants philosophy offered some valuable guidance? And I really love that because I think that one of the toughest things we have to do as companies, as leaders, and particularly as small giants is let people go. And it's something that we're not always very good at, and we tend to procrastinate. And if there's a feeling that if you have to let somebody go, then you're not really being a small giant because it's all about people and culture. When in fact the opposite is true. That part of being a small giant is holding people accountable and moving people along that may thrive somewhere else. And I'm really proud over the years of seeing people make really tough and important decisions, not only in their company, but sometimes for themselves to move on, because I think nothing's more important than feeling fulfilled in your life and your work. And I think small giants have learned, as hard as it is, to make those tough decisions. And that's part of building a great culture and part of being a small giant.
Well,
Thank you, Jay.
let me just
Yeah.
add to that, that if you do read the 10th anniversary edition and you look at the chapter on why or how small giants fail, you will see that if you look at the case of Rhythm and Hughes, for example, which is one of the companies in the book, but they became a very, very successful company, but they, among other things, they created Life of Pi, which was a Best Picture Academy Award with a boy on a raft in the middle of the ocean with a tiger. There was not really a boy with a tiger on a raft. That was all created by Rhythm and Hughes, and they won a Best Picture Academy Award for that, but they won it 11 days after they filed for Chapter 11. And and then eventually they had to be sold, or the company had to be sold. So one of the things that John Hughes, there's actually something everybody here might want to watch on YouTube. It's a video called Life After Pi. And it's really the story of what happened to Rhythm and Hughes after Pi and after the Life of Pi. And, one of the tough questions was exactly what Paul has just spoken about, which is John Hughes couldn't bring himself to lay people off at a time when the company couldn't survive if he didn't lay people off. And that is about as tough a situation as you can get into.
Yeah.
And people, if you read the story of another company in Small Giants, it was. I'm 78. I've got a worse than you, Jay.
That's okay.
Uh,
Yeah.
but if you, you know, this whole question of what do you do when the business gets in trouble? And frankly, the only way it can survive is to reduce its headcount. Then, you know, there are very difficult choices that have to be made, but they have to be made. And so.
Yeah, and there's a lot of small giants companies that, just like others, have been through that over the last few years. We just have like another minute left, Bo, and we have to go. But kind of any final thoughts for you? I know that 20 years later, you're still getting people who are reading the book for the first time, who are writing to you on LinkedIn, who are sharing. So the message continues to resonate. What's your thoughts about what the future holds for small giants?
Well, I will say this, is that I have been amazed, and I was just recently amazed at the Small Giants Summit to see all of these people. I mean, I would never have imagined that this book would have actually become the basis for an association as dynamic and as healthy and as vibrant as the Small Giants community. And you know, people frequently come up and thank me for that, and I have to tell them that I had nothing to do with it. It was really you, Paul, and Hamza, and Hamza's team, you know, at the Small Giants headquarters that has really done it. And I'm amazed by it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yes, our big national headquarters in Detroit, Michigan, our big office building there. But no, it's small. You know, Bridget, Katie, and Hemsa have done an incredible job. Bo, I just want to say thank you for inspiring all of us over all these years. And you're an icon and somebody really special and a wonderful friend. Thank you for doing what you've done so far, what you continue to do to spread the word. And thanks to everybody for joining us on the call. We want to honor the time, let you get back to your day. But thanks you for helping us celebrate 15 years of the Small Giants community, and we look forward to the next 15. So enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.